Welcome to Crossing Faiths. I'm John Pinna, and today we have Michael Kinnamon, who is a novelist, professor of theology, and an expert in interfaith relations, and the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches in the U.S. Welcome to the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And so, I was really interested in speaking with you. We've never met before. And because of your novel, and it's based on some of your experiences in Jerusalem, a rooftop in Jerusalem. Your novel, I started to identify with the character, and then you, and I said, I'm starting to regard this guy as an old friend, an old acquaintance. And so I'm really interested in your background. You have an ecumenical background. You're a professor that's turned novelist, big into literature and using literature as a teaching tool. And I thought maybe you could just unpack a little bit of that history as it culminates in the novel A Rooftop in Jerusalem.
I have kind of three careers, I suppose. One is I was a professor teaching ministers, really Protestant ministers, in seminaries and in universities, both here and in India. I taught also in India, teaching students there who were on track for ordination. And in all of those cases, I tried to open them to interfaith relationships as a part of their future. So I hope that I had an impact on a generation of Protestant ministers in this country who are now more open to Muslim and Jewish and Buddhist and Hindu and other colleagues around them than they might have been. And in that effort, I simply wasn't writing books, but was trying to put a human face on these colleagues. So I'd invite in, I might invite you if you were there to come in and meet with students so they'd get to know you as a person. Then I had this career of ecumenical leadership that was culminated in becoming the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches in this country, which was more political, more directly political than what I've been doing, trying to influence church leaders, trying to influence political leaders. We met a great deal with leaders in the Middle East, as you might imagine, because so many of the National Council churches have roots there. Syrian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, which is the largest church, of course, in the Palestinian community in Palestine. So there, once again, trying to meet people as friends and know them as colleagues, persons. And the same thing that happens with fiction. I think the great strength of a novel is it can put you inside the head of another person. It puts a face on headlines coming out of the Middle East in ways that other art forms struggle to do. So I think in some ways I've been doing the same thing over the years. I simply have shifted, and at age 70, it's very gratifying to find a new career and fortunately to find publishers for the first three of my novels. I'll add one other thing, John, that my PhD at the University of Chicago was in religion and literature. So in some ways, people have asked me about was there whiplash in moving from one kind of writing to another? Sure. But I was a bit primed for that because my master's exams were as much in, I don't know, epic poetry and 19th century British fiction as they were in theology. I tried to integrate these two. And then throughout my teaching career, I tried to use fiction in the teaching of theology. So the most interesting way to open students to intercultural perspectives is to get them reading fiction from the other places. So every year I taught a course called Literature from Around the World, where we would spend a good deal of time looking at, again, those human people who live in the places that we're otherwise studying more abstractly.
Yeah, we have a book club here in the in Kingston with the Kingston Library District, and it's all cultural books from different peoples from all over the world, and we just did we started the year off with Pashtun Tales, which is of from the the borderlands, and
Yeah.
so it was the most visited. I mean, I like to think that because everybody was interested in Afghanistan and Pakistan and stuff, that people came. But it was, I think most people came. I think that the reason why it was the most attended was because it was short stories and it wasn't a long novel. But I'm not going to do the math on that. But it was interesting because we got into some of the cultural nuances with these sort of works of fiction that were oral histories. Sweeter than, is there anything sweeter than salt, is one of the stories, right? So and so I think that literature, like I still remember Mac Fleck now in my medieval history or medieval literature class, and some of the epic poems, and they remind me of sort of anchor points with cultural norms that my literature teacher taught me. Even though now it's strange because I identified very, very closely with Daniel in the novel, and because of my personal experience and the storytelling that you were able to kind of dial in on this character that was in another land, experiencing multiple peoples, as was it with my career. But maybe we just take a little moment to walk through the novel and what it's about. I joked with you before we started recording about how I was kind of co-opted into a love story, and and I go, okay, and that was a little bit of an interesting component to this. But maybe you could unpack a little bit about.
I'd be happy to. I'd be happy to. I just wanted to add one anecdote from what you were saying earlier, that I was at a church assembly this summer pushing another book of mine, which is set more within a Christian context. And at that assembly, I had a former student come up to me and say, I still reread every year the work you had us read by Mahfouz.
Huh.
Now, that's very gratifying,
Yeah.
because it says that this novelist from Egypt has now entered this person's life and won't be the same as a result. His ministry undoubtedly won't be the same because of that. But I commend fiction to your listeners as one way of doing this kind of cross-cultural study. And Rooftop in Jerusalem really is about that. Another funny thing here is that many of the readers have told me that they think of A Rooftop in Jerusalem as a story about conflict in the Middle East that has a love story woven through it.
Right.
I think of it as a love story that's set against the backdrop of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So for me, the love story is foregrounded, but for many of the readers, they read it another way. It's interesting how the two parts of the novel. Again, I think it's a 40-year love affair between an American Christian named Daniel, that you've referred to, and an Israeli Jewish woman named Shoshana. Daniel comes to Israel for a junior year abroad at Tel Aviv, but he spends most of his weekends inside the old city of Jerusalem, staying in pretty cheap Arab hotels, 25 cents a night, and happens to be there. This is the opening scene of the book, with the burning of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the great Al-Aqsa Mosque, third holiest place in most of Islam, and the emotional equivalent, I think, in the Arab world of the burning of Notre Dame in the West. So I happened to be there, and people poured out onto the street, of course, calling for some kind of retribution, and Israeli troops were ringing the wall. And that incident serves as a kind of Rorschach test in the early part of the novel, because people respond to those events from different perspectives. And that's a part of what the novel tries to do, is to show the complexity of life in the midst of this sort of conflict. Daniel and Shoshana the ebb and flow of their relationship goes through the book for over a 40-year period. And the novel's divided into 5 major sections. Each one is a time when Daniel returns to Jerusalem for some extended period. And most of them then involve a closer relationship to Shoshana. But you also see through this progression, a change in Daniel, hopefully growth, spiritually, emotionally, politically, as he wrestles with this environment that for which he's always an outsider, but immersed in some way. I think, as we were talking earlier, you saw Jerusalem as almost a character in itself. And many readers often say that. He has a love affair with Shoshana and Jerusalem. And at one point, she's not sure whether he's going to come back more because he wants to see Jerusalem or her. But the book hopefully captures both of those together. In fact, the way in which it's structured, although I don't expect reviewers to get this necessarily, is that the ebb and flow of the love affair parallels that of the peace process. So that the relationship between Daniel and Shoshana is at its most intense in the early 90s, and then runs into all kinds of conflict, as you might imagine, and I'm not going to give away the end.
Oh, well, it's interesting. You have this, I mean, what a great way to frame a conversation about current events in both, sort of real and satirical moments with what's going on with the this dramatic backdrop. And then, of course, it was strange. It was an interesting comment that you mentioned where you talk about most people look at it as the conflict or the events as the main character, as the main point, and puts the love story secondary.
Yeah, woven through it, yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't take it that way, and I don't know, maybe there's, I always say
bless you, that's good.
Not the right way, but I also, like you said, I was identifying very hard with Daniel. I mean, I had a sort of multi-faith relationship with a young lady back in the day. I'm 50 years old, so it's like, so I'm thinking back and I'm going, oh gosh, and then so immediately I was there and I'm going, this professor, stirring up a case of the feels, the romanticals, as you call it, So as I got really nervous. I was like, I don't want to get a case of the feels with this book, and so I immediately identified with him being in this foreign land. And some of my first work was in Africa, for example. I was my first international development work was in Cameroon, and it doesn't get much more foreign than a New Yorker going into Cameroon, and so I immediately identify with Daniel, and then on top of that, his relationship. But maybe this is an interesting thing to talk about, the identifying, because obviously the news and the events of Israel-Palestine is at the forefront of most of the media, at least quite a bit of time that is spent on it, and it's all in all of our minds with Israel-Gaza. The idea that it's a love story and you're focusing on these characters, and then this idea, this need, this want to kind of give everything meaning instead of just saying, you want to know what it is, a love story between two people. And that's something that is everybody can identify with that, and it's also very Christian.
What's Christian? The novel as a whole?
Well, the struggle for love, and the struggle to find purpose and understand where, how does
isn't that also Muslim?
It is Muslim. I know. I'd say it's in everybody's tradition. It's something.
Yeah, I think so.
But from a Christian perspective, the idea of struggling with love and in an interfaith setting is difficult, even when it comes to something that's not romantic. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because it's really a good an anchor point in your life's work.
There was, for better or worse, no Shoshana in my life. So that these are fictional characters. Right. But crossing these boundaries, crossing faiths, is, of course, increasingly common in our world. Sure. I think wonderfully so. I have, for instance, a daughter who's from India. And she and I are now planning to go to Jerusalem, which will be her first time there next spring, just the two of us. A wonderful trip, so I can expose my American Indian daughter to my background in the Middle East, where I've had a chance to study and travel over the years. something wonderful about that, John.
Yeah.
That, we're in a world where those are possibilities. And I regret deeply that we see a backlash against some of that embrace of diversity in our time now. And my hope is that fiction will be one way of pushing back against that backlash to remind us of just how wonderful this can be. I think the love affair in the story is really quite wonderful. Um, they uh, it can be rough. It can be very difficult at times because they live in different continents and are separated by the wall of the Atlantic Ocean, among other things. And yet, um, I'll back up here. I have a friend in town, a rabbi who writes novels, and he just published one called Here There Is No Why,
Hmm.
which comes out of the Holocaust. A prisoner in one of the death camps asks a Nazi guard, "Why did you do that?" "Here there is no why," he responds.
Wow.
Well, it also applies, I've told my friend, to love.
Right.
In the novel, you probably noticed there are at least two other women who are much better suited for Daniel.
Right.
They have the same background he does. They live in the same country that he does. They would be much more appropriate. But with love, here there is no why.
Right.
He loves who he loves, and Shoshana wrestles with it even more than he does. But you feel the same thing, I think, by the end. And so um, that's yes, I want to tell a good story. Uh, some of the questions that people ask me have to do with how did you come up with this or how did you come up with that? Well, a lot of it is that when I'm really clicking, I listen to the characters.
Right.
They tell me. They tell me what they would do next. They tell me these matters of the heart because I try to listen to them. When that happens, then I feel like I'm really functioning as a novelist and I'm communicating to others a depth of a real relationship and not one that's um, an ideological thing to which I attach a plot. I
Right.
never want to do that. I want to tell a story, has to do with characters. Characters have fallen in love for reasons that are beyond explanation.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, you can't, we're not afforded the luxury of choosing the person we fall in love with. That's, so that rang true in my mind. And like I said, I sent you a series of questions prior to starting the podcast, and I'm going to go, I'm going to go off the rails because I got a case of the feels from the book, which is good. And that's part of it. Maybe I've been involved in all these in all these global events back through my career that I want to focus on the simple things. I'm not sure, but I was like, do they gotta get back together at the end? They got something, So
Don't give it away.
I'm not giving it away. But so here's the thing. Here's a question that throughout the book that you're talking about Jerusalem as a character, but I think I wanted to ask you about faith as both as both an accelerant and tempering tool. It's an interesting thread throughout the book. At least that's what I came across, and I go, which how you were how did you were how would you able to, or the weaving of faith as something that would accelerate or act as an accelerant or a tempering tool within the plot. How did you manage to weave that in? I mean, you did it very, very well. And so, it starts off with the burning of the Alexa Mosque. So, like, there we go. It's like you have drama immediately, which is very good. The bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so from there, you could actually have a great movie. So I wonder if you could just, unpack
Sure.
for me.
By the way, I think there are so many of these world-shaking events that we in the United States pay far too little attention to.
True enough.
And one of those in 1969 was this really tragic event for so much of the Muslim world, the burning of Al-Aqsa. And I just happened to be there, and so it's imprinted on my life, but I'm afraid that isn't true for so many. And so if I can open up that part of the world also, I think that's important. I don't quite know. It's such a great question that you're asking. I think religion that involves exploration and openness to new experience is in general, and certainly in the novel, what helps the characters to grow. And that is, in that sense, it's positive religion. Daniel, when he's celebrating Shabbat with Shoshana at the beginning, he didn't have a clue about any of this when he goes there. Almost still doesn't really when he falls in love with her. And he has these stirrings of religiosity that come from his experiences in the old city. And he applies to that the fact that he comes out of a Christian background. So he's still vaguely Christian. That's kind of what he thinks is by default. But he has most religious experiences with her
Right.
on Friday evening. Openness, this kind of exploration of the other is when he really grows. I think religion, and this is true in general, not only in the novel, but certainly in the novel, when religion is driven by fear, it really becomes negative. If I dare say, I think fundamentalism is the religious form of the world's anxiety. We see so much, our whole society is saturated by fear now. And fundamentalism, in some sense, both plays on that and both drinks of that water and at the same time contributes to it. But I also, and I think this is true of the novel, I undercut almost every absolute assertion like that. So Shoshana, for instance, has a almost physical aversion to the Orthodox Jews,
Right.
which becomes almost a fundamentalism of its own.
Right. Right.
As she rejects them for a kind of fearful basis also. So I undercut her attack on fear-based religion because it's fear-based.
Right. 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 And in the same ilk, when I think there's the checkpoint, the Calandra checkpoint, where there's an incident and she's very defensive of trying to figure out what's caused that altercation, that there's a shooting, and she's on the other side of saying, well, then there's a justification with that, which is more political than it is religious, but it shows that duality of her of who she is.
Periodically, Daniel says something like, wow, I remember now that you're an Israeli Jew. I mean, he forgets from time to time just what her background is also. And so he's caught off guard because he expects her to react like he does.
Right.
And
Yeah.
even though she's born in the United States, she doesn't, because she's claimed this other kind of identity. The scene you pointed to is one I like a lot. They go to the Botanical Garden in Jerusalem, and he tells this scene which he was involved in with a student group, where an Israeli Jeep rams a fruit cart of a Palestinian who's set up alongside the road saying he doesn't have permit to be there, and a crowd gathers. This is at the Calandia checkpoint, and stones are thrown at the Jeep and shots fired. And so she asks him about this, and he describes it briefly, and she goes, what precipitated and what happened before the Jeep rammed the cart? Well, stones were thrown. So she says, well, this is a real cycle, isn't it? Our soldiers are attacked, they respond and are accused of brutality.
Right.
And he goes, well, let me tell you about the Palestinians that I'm with, who will say, Israel takes our land, we respond, and are called terrorists. Now, that sets up the kind of dual cycle that are head on in this conflict. In this book, I try to complicate that picture. But I think you'll appreciate also, John, there comes a point at which you have to say equivalent alternatives won't do. And so Daniel moves through the book from a role of bridge builder, where he tries to hear all sides of the conflict, and that's his identity almost, to a point where he really finally decides there are some things here to which you have to say no. Right. And that's a growth in him that I hope people see in the book.
Well, that you draw these lines. It's when I was at the American Islamic Congress, we stayed very, very clear of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, right? And this, I was there until 2015. and we would always say everything that needs to be said has been said. Someone needs to make a decision. That was our stance, because the problem is we would end up getting, because you get co-opted into,
Yeah.
which side, who deserves to live and who deserves to die, that sort of thing. Anyway, so, but there's a tendency to do that. There's a tendency to say, well, both sides are responsible, and to keep it symmetrical.
Yeah.
I'm maybe I misread the novel, but I wanted to kind of enter into this. You look at this, the characters are sort of address this in an asymmetrical pattern. One where Shoshana is obviously Israeli and believes in her identity, but there's also she's interacting with Daniel, and so she's foraying into this sort of, in an expeditionary way, into thinking differently. The same thing
As he is in the other direction.
Yeah, and so there's this vacillation back and forth, and it becomes asymmetrical in the sense that, and with what you're just talking about with Daniel, does start drawing lines in the sand for himself. As someone who knows who he is and what he's about, it was something that throughout my career and my life, and I still do. Where do I stand with this? As something like, for example, with Israel-Palestine right now. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that asymmetrical approach to the backdrop of Israel-Palestine within the context of the novel.
Yeah, this is such an important question, and it goes back to my previous career, if I might also, in that I would say a dominant theme of my writings in theology, ecumenical interfaith studies over the years, is the tension between unity and justice. The more you try to hold together a wide circle of diversity in unity, the fewer justice issues you can address together.
Right. Yeah.
So that in some sense, a unity and diversity cuts against some of the justice issues we want to deal with. So, for instance, when I was at the National Council of Churches, I had members of my executive committee saying to me, don't reach out to these other churches to be part of the National Council. They'll just water down what we want to say about immigration or healthcare or whatever.
Right.
Well, we're in the unity and diversity business. So that's yes, I'm going to reach out to these others. On the other hand, once they're in, we're not simply a debating society. We also come together and we try to determine what does Christian faith in council's context have to say about these issues of the day. And then we tie a knot in the rope of that at that point, and we say we're not coming back from here. Together we have said this about climate change or whatever it is, and those issues matter. And I, therefore, as General Secretary, can speak out on those issues boldly because I know that together we've been able to say these things. That's very tough. That's very tough to do. And there, you always run into the issues of, okay, with the Catholics, we can deal with all kinds of healthcare issues, and then there's abortion.
Right.
Do we have to bracket that? Well, that becomes very problematic. The big issue, of course, with regard to interfaith was with what we do with legitimate aspirations, in my judgment, of Palestinians.
Yeah.
And so the National Council would speak out strongly about issues of a Palestinian state, living secure borders, as Israel also has a right to security guarantees. We would speak out about these kinds of matters. But we would say we never adopted BDS, for instance, boycott sanction policies, because that would have alienated us from the Jewish colleagues with whom we were working to try and accomplish some of these other things. If this makes sense. So I could work, for instance, with Israeli ambassador at that time was Michael Oren on family unification for Palestinians, on building permits for Palestinians, on opening up checkpoints for Palestinians. And boy, I did work on those all the time. And then I got slammed for not simply saying the occupation is always wrong. All right, these are really tough issues to negotiate. In the book, I try and do the same thing, really. I show the complexity of the situation. I show Daniel wrestling with being a bridge builder as he's buffeted by his friends in the old city and with Shoshana and her friends and family. And then finally, toward the end of the book, a couple of incidents happen that push him in the direction of realizing that justice is being denied to a Palestinian population, and he has to take a stand. Now, does that mean standing against Shoshana? Oh boy. So you watch the tension build in the book as he wrestled with those kinds of questions. No, I don't have final answers to it. It's just been one I've tried to negotiate for most of my career.
Well, I think that, you have this idea of, you have the local population. I think I sent something over to you about the diaspora versus locals, and then I said to myself, I sent that question over. I go, where does Daniel fit in that? He's not diaspora. He's not local. He's really another element in there.
He's the outsider.
He's an outsider
who becomes immersed in an outsider way, but he remains an outsider to that situation.
And so I thought maybe we chat a little bit about how, because I'm big on food diplomacy. I don't know if you read my background. I
Yes.
make babka in Russia, and in I retired from national security work, and now I do development work. But I have a small bakery cafe, and I make babka, and like I said, learned how to make it from a Russian Jewish lady when I was in school in Moscow, and I wanted to ask. So you have these diaspora and these locals, but then you have this other element, right, Daniel? But he's brought into the fold through meals. He's brought in the fold with a core component within this hospitality element. Maybe it's not just meals. I think maybe it's better to say hospitality. You started our conversation off with, he's staying in a room for 25 cents a night, and so there's a component of hospitality that's he brought into the fold. And I always think of Lawrence of Arabia, and he went a little native. So maybe you could kind of talk to me about that component of the character development, where he's now talking about tough issues over food. He's brought into different populations with food and hospitality, and that allows him to a component of socialization that doesn't normally happen when you're just a tourist.
I entirely agree, and I want to come to your bakery, so you have to send me a note on where it is, and we'll go there. I also wanted to say, Yossi Klein Halevi, well-known commentator in Israel on politics, writes an endorsement for the book in which he says that I come as close as any outsider possibly can to the inner reality of Palestinians and Israelis. That's the highest tribute I can imagine. I'm not an insider. I don't know it from the inside. But as an outsider, that's where I want Daniel to be also. So he becomes really immersed in these things. And the way in which he gets there is by way of hospitality, as you say. So the book begins not with the burning of Al-Aqsa exactly, but he's staying in this hotel, which is really pretty down and out.
Sure.
And he goes in the evenings, as I did when I was a student. This part's taken from my own experience. Most of the scenes aren't, but this one really is. And we would sit around in the evening with old guys smoking, and they'd bring in the tea from outside, and we'd have tea together, and then the oud player would come in and he'd play for a while. Oh my goodness, it's magical. This really is such a privilege to be invited in as an outsider into those kinds of moments. One of my favorite scenes in the book is with Mrs. P at Sukkot. So he has this girlfriend who doesn't turn out to be Shoshana. It's Maya, who's a better fit for him, but and she takes him with her to the family's Sukkot meal, where he's completely clueless, and the conversation is wonderfully inviting, but inevitably gets around to the burning of Al-Aqsa, right. Which is now seen from a completely different perspective there. And then another of the major meals comes with her family in the Seder meal, when he meets Shoshana's father for the first time, and also he puts very pointed questions to him, because in a meal context, you can't get away from those.
Right.
You can't say, well, I'll get back to you on that, because you're sitting together over whatever it is. So uh,
But
those are times that are not only of hospitality, but also probing and conversation. And so, yes, it plays a big role. I read your question, though, with a smile, because I don't think I was nearly as intentional about using meals those ways. It just, that's where the characters went.
yeah, family. If I know that this is a takeaway from anything anybody really anybody anywhere is that meals is where families come together. Everybody has to
Yeah.
and so whether it's intentional, it's just a reality of life is that people say, I'm hungry, let's grab something to eat, coffee and cake in New York, right? So but there was a component of that I thought was, oh God, this you really do nail it. I mean, when I think of Jerusalem, and I've been there back and forth to Israel, my first thought is to shawarma. So that's where, part of that has to be with being of Afghan descent. We always like to work out our Afghan muscle, which is really our stomach. So we go, and when we're eating, we're thinking of the next meal. So, but I thought, what an interesting component is these dialogues that happen over meals, and really hospitality, these elements, bringing someone into. Daniel kind of really experiences this idea of identity, of Jerusalem, this sort of interwoven tapestry, where as an outsider he's experiencing it all, and aggregating it in, and while these events are happening, and it's kind of neat to have that hospitality as an element of it.
You asked also at one point, I remember, about where I would go back to when I go to Jerusalem. Like,
Yeah,
what's the first place I go to because of, is it a holy site or something like this?
sure.
No, when I take my daughter in the spring, I got a friend who has a falafel stand on
Right,
Christian Quarter Road, just around the corner from the Holy Sepulchre. And
right,
Samir has become a friend over the years, and that's what I think of when I think about going back to Jerusalem. It's not the sites, it's the people who live there.
right.
I got a friend in Jerusalem, Franz Bowen, who's a Belgian priest. He's lived there for decades at the Church of St. Anne, just inside the Lion's Gate. He works behind the scenes. He's not a bishop. He's not a bigwig at all. He works behind the scenes to promote Christian relationships in a city where Christians are famous for fighting each other.
Right,
So
right.
Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. Franz is there helping to set up all of the worship experiences. I love this guy. I take her to meet him,
Right.
because he's not, is he of Jerusalem? Yes. Is he diaspora? Who can say that? He's
Right.
lived there for decades. Uh, and yet he's Belgian. The lines are blurred. You know this as well as anybody.
Yeah.
And they're blurred in our world today in ways that I hope we can build on.
Yeah, I mean, when I do multi-faith work, one of the things I do is ground assessments in post-conflict zones, and I go in and with multi-faith crowd, and one of my core companions is a Antiochian priest, and,
Uh-huh.
and it's funny because when we travel together. And you know how a lot of times when you're doing stuff as multi-faith space, when you're in the room, everybody's all friends, and then everybody goes back to their hotel rooms. In this case, we bunk together. And so, because we were involved in that security space together, so we know each other very personally. Like, he's seen me, salat out and pray. And it's such an important component about how we interact with each other. But you're talking about Samir, who's a vendor. I don't know if he's a street vendor, but he's a vendor on the streets, serving a meal, but the smells making a difference. We're talking about food diplomacy again, and we're talking about
Yeah, absolutely.
and you want your daughter
Absolutely.
to experience that because you've experienced that. And
Absolutely.
anchor point.
Yeah. And I want the Samirs of the world also to find their way into these books.
Yeah.
Somebody needs to remember the Samirs of the world, because that kind of serving people, like you say, serving food is an important part of it. By the way, may I add one other thing? I have several writings in which I name guidelines for dialogue interfaith dialogue. I have one book that has a chapter in it on how Christians and Jews can talk to one another about tough issues.
Right.
And so the first guideline, very first, before anything else, to establish relationships with the other. Know the other person as a friend. Put a face on the other person. You want to ask me what one thing would I say to the listeners? Are you going to do something tomorrow to promote this? Put yourself in a position to know someone you otherwise wouldn't know.
Yeah.
And get to know them personally as a friend. Build up that kind of relationship, just what you're talking about with your Antiochian friend.
Yeah, no, I just went to a Jehovah's Witness open house. Of course, the first thing I asked is, are they serving food? And so that was the first thing I got. So I was like, well, if they're serving food, then there's a pretty good chance I'll come. And it was a friend of mine was going, and he goes, they're going to try to convert. I was like, well, they can, if you told me God doesn't exist today, Allah doesn't exist today, I still would believe. So there's no shaking of who I am, but I'm happy to go and talk and engage. And I was building relationships with these individuals. It was really funny over food, and we're talking about the timeline and all kinds of other things, and it's there's the food engagement, but then there's this other element of you just we're talking and bonding as New Yorkers or people who like this meal or people do that in it. And now I'm sort of building that arc, obviously, to bring them onto the podcast. But it's because now we have a social
That's
engagement,
right.
social.
That's right. Get to know people that way. I imagine, by the way, you're big friends with Sikhs, since the Sikh community always serves food everywhere. They show up and serve us all.
Yeah. No, I have
Yeah,
a long-standing relationship with this community. Here's a question for you. So, what was the threshold of what you included and didn't include in the novel? When you were redlining, is there something that you say, oh, I should have left in, or you're saying there was something you struggled over? Because a lot of times it's like, oh, it's a feel good love story, and obviously in the backdrop of Jerusalem, some of the asymmetrical elements that we were talking about are there. But as a novelist, as a Christian, and also someone who cares deeply about the region and humanity and dignity, were there things that you decided that you wanted to omit, or did it free flow? And if so, I don't want you don't have to get too deep if it's an omission that you don't want to include. But I kind
no,
of that
no, I didn't. There's not really a major omission that I left out of the book. I'd have to say that this book came together, the structure of it, more than my others. I've written the three that are published, and then one other one we might want to talk about in a minute also that builds on this book in a way. Uh, so this one came together. I didn't have major parts. There were things I had to improve in it, certainly. I have one friend who constantly tells me that my protagonists in all of my novels are too nice.
hmm,
And this is very deliberate. In a world that's filled with meanness and nasty exchanges, I want characters who are not perfect by any means, but morally upright as protagonists. And certainly I think that Daniel falls into that category. But I roughed him up a bit. He's indecisive. There are lots of things about him that you can look at him and go, "Oh my goodness, get a grip, man." But he's not morally negative. And so I do that. I'm not as visual as my wife, who's an art consultant, an artist. And so I've gone to Jerusalem with her, and she helps me also to see things that otherwise I would have missed, because I can write dialogue, I think, pretty effectively.
hmm.
And I can get inside the characters and hear them moving. But to see the contexts, Martine has really helped me with that a lot. And so I've benefited from others in order to add things. There wasn't any major part. There were some things where you'll see where language is tricky. Um, uh, is it the Temple Mount or the Haram al-Sharif?
Right.
Well, it's both. It depends on who's talking about it. And so I try to walk that line by showing how different communities will linguistically also portray different parts of the city, for instance.
Well, Daniel, to piggyback on that, Daniel, over the course of his visits and the span of the book, talks about how the the identity of Israel changes. Where some places that were very familiar become unfamiliar. The idea of the wall, the border wall. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that struggle within the novel and how that becomes a core component of. It's a counterbalance to the hospitality and the food diplomacy that we talked about, and it's something we all experience. We all go back to places and we see things, and you want to go back to. I've spent a lot of time in New Orleans, and so I went back to a place that made the French sandwiches, cochon de lait and that sort of thing, and croque monsieur, and they the grocery store was there, but they didn't make sandwiches anymore, and I was so deflated and disappointed. and I maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because that's a counterbalance, I think, to the hospitality element, is that change is inevitable and sometimes it's not nice. And Daniel experiences that quite a bit.
Yeah, he doesn't like the change because he wants, of course, to freeze it into the moment that was so determinative for the arc of his life.
Right.
This 1969-1970 school year not only was the beginning of this 40-year love affair, but it also moved him in the direction of a more religious identity and so on. So he freezes Jerusalem, as it were, in that moment. And Valerie, I won't give away, Valerie's a key figure for me and a wonderful character, tells him at one point that you're like those people who would say you should have been in Paris back when the artists were here, or you
Right.
should have been. So there always is this nostalgia for whatever it is, the point in a history that you identify with.
Yeah.
I have a friend in the Armenian quarter who, as a historian, George Hintlian. He's a great historian of late 19th century, early 20th century Jerusalem. He's helped me a lot. And George will talk about how it looked back here when the British were here. So different moments like that that figure into it. The counter, in some ways, to the hospitality, which breaks down walls, is that the city is filled with walls.
Right.
And so you've got walls that both function as a sacred element in the story, and you've got walls that function as a divisive element in the story. The Western Wall, of course, being one example, but so many of the others. And so the symbol of Rooftop is key to the book, and I'm not going to spell this out because I want readers to figure out what they think rooftop means for them. But in some sense, the rooftop is the place where you can see beyond the walls.
Right.
Because both of those are important, both for Daniel and for the rest of the book. And even that's undercut because Valerie, at the end, doesn't like rooftops at all and much prefers the street level where she can engage one-on-one in conversation with all the vendors up and down the Via Dolorosa or wherever. So the book uses those symbols and then tries to undercut them as well, because all of that's very complex.
No, it's an interesting element that it's, again, spoke to me. I returned to Afghanistan after the family left in 1896, and I was the first sort of go back, and I met with distant cousins, but there was a moment where I was up on the roof of oh God, I can't remember. I want to say I can't remember the name of the NGO, and looking out, and you're having one of those moments where you're just like, yeah, I'm looking at the Afghan sky, and we can look across these rooftops, and sure enough, there was a bunch of guys fighting. They were roosters cockfighting, right? So like there was a reality of this gambling pool that was on the roof while I'm like looking out and having a moment, and so it's very liberating, and then immediately you're brought into the realities of culture and experience, and you did, I think you did a very good job at sort of bringing that the walls in as a character, as a buffer, and also as a sort of liberating force, because like the Wailing Wall, for example, is a place that has great spirituality, but then you have something that's a physical wall, that's a defensive element.
Yeah, absolutely.
That
And
has its own identity. Yeah.
yeah, I'm happy to say that as a student, I traveled through Afghanistan.
Oh, right on.
I went in Herat and took a bus down to Kandahar and up through Ghazni and Kabul and then Jalalabad, where of course we had the tragedy this last week, and then out through the Khyber Pass. Um, uh, that was a wonderful experience. Did I know enough about it to write it? No. I mean that's the question is you can experience something, but have you experienced enough of it to identify something culturally? I teach periodically in India. India remains foreign to me. I would have real difficulty writing about it. I could write about a foreigner in India,
Sure.
but I couldn't write about Indian culture itself. So I felt like finally I had reached the point after multiple times in Jerusalem, many, many times back there and so on, where, and lecturing and studying and living in the area, that I was an outsider with enough comfort to be able to do justice to it.
Yeah.
And what's been very gratifying is I have some friends in the old city who I gave an advance copy to, handed him a paper copy to read early on.
Sure.
And I had one of them, guy who has a curio shop just inside the Jaffa Gate, who said to me that I like the book, it's my life. Now, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, how gratifying is that? So, but boy, you have to be just in the right moment. So outsider, you ask about that diaspora, outsider, but at the same time, enough of an insider to be able to say that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Well, I think that we have, maybe we'll have to take a trip to Afghanistan and we'll do, Rooftop in Kabul. But I consider myself an American of Afghan descent. I don't have that. Although I have one foot in one world and one foot in the other, because of my family upbringing. The challenge is that even my great grandfather, when he left, his idea of Afghanistan was frozen in time.
Yeah.
The language is ancient, right? That I learned. So even that we don't have the words for things. So it's like
Yeah.
time. But and so he was a diaspora, and that was frozen in time. But Daniel becomes a diaspora from like the 69, 70. He sort of has his idea of and he goes back and he's like, well, none of this is familiar. This isn't right, and he's kind of muddling through that, even though he's not from there, but he had that moment in time, just like your friend, your colleague, who was saying, oh, the British years, you should have seen it, like, and I don't
Yeah.
like I said, I'm not being pejorative in that, but the idea of like there must have been some amazing moments in time under British rule, because it was very, very different. It's closer to the source, the old world,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Well, this is Daniel goes back, and I felt this also at times. Like, where are the donkeys? What are these little tractors zipping around the streets of the old city? So everybody does that, I suppose. It just makes it. I want to stress also how fiction can break down some of these stereotypes that we have. I think that's so important. And it's a real role of fiction. I have ran into someone not too long ago, a Christian, who's quite well educated, who told me he didn't know there were Christians in the Middle East.
right.
Now, it's you can give statistics, but those kind of slip past people.
Sure.
But you show a story about Christians living inside this walled city or whatever, and that stays with you. I think another part of that is the incredible diversity of Israeli Jewish life.
Yeah.
Isabel Kirchner, the really fine New York Times Middle East correspondent, has this recent book, Land of Hope and Fear, I think is the title of it, where she outlines some of these, in wonderful prose, some of the diversity of Israeli Jewish life. Well, that's one way of getting at it, but another way is actually show it. And
Sure.
so that you see some of that diversity embedded in characters. So breaking down stereotypes, real role of fiction. I commend it to everyone in this day and age.
Well, I have a quote by you, and that I'm going to tease you with to talk about what's next, or what you're working on next. There's a quote or something that I pulled out. It says, "It's better to a history is better imagined than remembered." Something
Yeah,
thereabouts.
yeah,
I mean, I'm paraphrasing a little bit,
yeah,
but
yeah,
I think that, and in the context of that component, it's not about revisionist history. It's about you writing novels and fiction. So, maybe tell me a little bit about that. Is that as sort of a muse to uh, write and elaborate on stories and places and things that you have been exposed to and know, where you're trying to coalesce these ideas into a novel.
it is a transition into what I'm working on now. I often feel that if you're writing fiction, work that is imagined rather than simply remembered is stronger as fiction. Uh, when I try to remember what it was like to be in that Al Kamal hotel in 1969, it gets pretty static.
Right.
It begins. When I take that kernel of memory and I begin to imagine it, it more comes alive. I
Sure.
can shape it then also in ways that not to tell a lesson, but rather ways that make it more exciting for the reader, more interesting for the reader. And so I always think that fiction is better imagined rather than remembered. Having said that, of course, the irony is that we're now realizing that much memory is itself imagination.
Sure.
We make up the past in a way because we remember it through the lens of imagination also. So that's complex. But yes, I believe that. And so my new novel called Becoming Nathaniel, which also takes place two-thirds of it, more than that, even in Jerusalem, um, isn't at all autobiographical. Not a single scene in it really that is autobiographical. And I think it's a better book. I think Rooftop in Jerusalem is a good book, and I'm very happy with it. But I'm getting better at this as I write. Uh, Starting a career like this at age 70, it was on the job training, the first two novels,
Sure.
and I got a lot of good feedback. I now have a writing coach I periodically send stuff to who helps me as well. So I'm getting better at writing. And the new one, Becoming Nathaniel, adds an element of complexity I hadn't dealt with, of different layers of time. In that the character's wife dies and he goes to Jerusalem to figure out why she wanted to be there, because she was very religious and wanted to be in Jerusalem, and he doesn't know why. And he goes there to try and find out. And it's a story about grief, because in some sense he's evading the hard task of grieving as he does this.
Sure.
But he goes there and he takes with him a diary he finds of his great grandfather who traveled to Jerusalem in 1904. Now, this is where my friend George Hintlian comes in. He can tell me, oh, there was a market just inside the Jaffa Gate, and down the steps a ways there would have been a money changer, and he would have had a basket with a net across the top of it with coins. And now, this is fabulous stuff.
Yeah.
And so I can begin to see what it was like in 1904. Well, I added another element in that around that time, by the way, Americans were traveling a good deal to the Middle East then, on the heels of Mark Twain, who went
Right.
there in the late 1860s and wrote the book Innocents Abroad. And so Americans began to travel into that part of the world. Um, and my character can't have a love affair because his wife just died. So I write the love affair into the diary.
I see.
As
I see.
the great grandfather, he begins to realize has this while he's there in Jerusalem in 1904. But he carries with him a diary of a honest to God pilgrim in the 12th century. After the Crusaders there in 1099, for the next until Saladin in 1187, Christians dominated the city, and that's when the Holy Sepulchre was rebuilt and so on. And there were lots of pilgrims, and so I make up a pilgrim. I call him Alardus of Magdeburg.
Huh.
He writes his diary, which were being, by the way, real diaries were being translated about that era by the Palestine Text Society.
Wow.
And so my great-grandfather of my character takes with him this pilgrim's diary. And at some points, I've got it so that even within a single paragraph, you'll have 3 different historical layers written into the narrative. So once again, the dominant thing there isn't so much place. Rooftop, place is a major element.
Sure.
In this new book, time plays a much bigger role as as Nate begins to identify with the past in a different kind of way historically.
Wow, it's so fantastic. I mean, I like you said, I'm looking forward to it. When's it coming out?
As soon as I find a publisher who wants it.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you taking the time. It really means a lot for you to kind of unpack this. I was, like I said, a little bit goofy walking into it because, like I said, it gave me a little bit of a case of the feels, and I go, God, Danielle, there's a little bit of a kindred spirit going on, and so I appreciate not only you sending me the book, but taking the time to unpack some of the questions and some of the components for our listenership. It means a lot.
My pleasure, and fine conversation. Thank you for that.
Thank you.